Hello and good afternoon, everyone. We warmly welcome you to the ISAS panel discussion on India's National Monetization Pipeline, Prospects and Challenges. Before we proceed, kindly mute your microphones and switch off your videos throughout the session. Recently, the Honorable Finance Minister of India, Mrs. Sharmila Kanta, announced a policy to monetize brownfield infrastructure assets in several sectors. The proceeds from this initiative is likely to be used to fund the National Infrastructure Pipeline. This panel discussion with our eminent experts will discuss the prospects and challenges of this initiative. We have amidst us today His Excellency Mr. P. Kumaran, High Commissioner of India to Singapore. We warmly welcome and thank you for joining us today, High Commissioner. On the panel, we have with us four distinguished experts: Dr. Anantha Nageshwaran, Member, Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, Government of India, and Non-Resident Senior Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, Professor Rajesh Chakrabarti, Director, Management Development Institute, Gurgaon, India, Ms. Sharmila Kanta, Principal Consultant and Lead International Research, Confederation of Indian Industry, New Delhi, and Dr. Amitendu Palat, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economics, Institute of South Asian Studies. The discussion will be moderated by Mr. Vinod Rai, Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, and former Comptroller and Auditor General of India. Finally, if you have any questions or feedback to share, please forward them via chat. The questions will be consolidated for the participants to answer. I now invite Mr. Vinod Rai to deliver the opening remarks and begin the panel discussion. Over to you, Mr. Rai.
Thank you, Divya, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We have Mr. Kumaran, the High Commissioner of India and Singapore with us, distinguished panelists, and our most eminent guests who have joined us this afternoon to discuss a policy initiative undertaken by the Government of India, which, if implemented with diligence, is, I'm certain, architecture to have a multiplier effect in unlocking value towards infrastructure development in the country. What we have assembled together to discuss today, as Divya mentioned, is the ambitious National Monetization Program launched by the government to monetize brownfield infrastructure assets over a period of 4 years. The monetization program, as has been made public, shows that the government intends to raise about 6 trillion rupees, or roughly $80 billion over the next 4 years by monetizing several core assets to free up locked capital for asset creation. The Niti Aayog report describes asset monetization as a transfer of performing assets to unlock idle capital and reinvesting it in other assets or projects that deliver improved or additional benefits. The critical factors of the current policy is that monetization is only of rights, not ownership. There will be no land sale to private players, and only brownfield de-risk assets are to be monetized. And the instruments that are proposed to be used are toll, operate, transfer, or operation, management, development, or refurbish, operate, maintain, and transfer. And yearly targets, which have been laid down by the government, are to be monitored through our dashboard. Now, government has been very cautious to ensure a change in the terminology due to the strong political undertones associated with the term privatization. From 2022 to 2025, the government is planning to offer existing assets across sectors to initiate organizations, to private organizations, to generate additional revenue, and at the same time, to maintain and manage the assets in a professional manner. The top 3 sectors by value which have been identified are monetization of roads, railways, and power, with a respective share of 27%, 25%, and 15% in the total asset value. The government is relying on its experience with sectors such as power and roads to carry.
Hello. Hi, Mr. Rai, can you hear me?
I think he dropped out, sir.
Okay. Ananta, if you are with us and you are able to join us, thank you. Let me, on behalf of ISAS, on behalf of Mr. Rai, there's a sudden disruption in his connection.
Right.
I apologize for that. I apologize to everybody else. And good to see you bright and smiling out there. Welcome to this event. And you are aware of our batting order today. You are supposed to start off the proceedings. So could I take this responsibility on behalf of Mr. Rai and invite you to start the proceedings? Thank you, Anand. Go ahead.
So how many minutes I have?
You can easily go on for 10 minutes.
Okay, let me just turn my clock on just to make sure that I don't overshoot. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. My apologies to my fellow panelists and to the gracious host, my friend Amit Palit, for the slight delay I had in being able to sign into this panel discussion. My apologies, and let me sort of commence my remarks. So first of all, the National Monetization Pipeline is a welcome announcement. And it is a policy that has been in the making across governments. Just as the Goods and Services Tax or the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, etc., were finally brought to life by the NDA government, but at the same time, they have been in the works for 10 to 15 years. The idea of asset monetization isn't particularly new. It was first attempted way back in the UPA government as well. And many of the highway projects have indeed been monetized under the public-private partnership, sort of build, own and transfer. All these schemes have already been in existence. So in that sense, monetization of public assets isn't a new phenomenon. And therefore, one should not see this as a sort of a untested policy. What has made this somewhat special is the fact that the number that's mentioned appears quite large, 6 trillion Indian rupees, where 66,000 billion, and you can say it's roughly equivalent to $85 billion. And therefore, this number looks somewhat significant, and there is a certain fanfare associated with this. India has experience with monetization, both good and bad. And the bulk of the assets that have been monetized in the past, of course, pertain to highway and road assets. And even in this plan, at least about 2/3 of the assets pertain to railways and roads. Now, the underlying rationale behind this is twofold, or maybe even three. One is, of course, that in the current situation, post-COVID, recovery has been A, fragile, and B, uneven. Therefore, a certain public impetus has to be given to the economic growth. And it's always the case that infrastructure investments have a huge multiplier effect. But going into the post-pandemic recovery, in the Indian fiscal situation is not particularly great, allowing the government leeway to spend, use fiscal resources to kickstart a public investment infrastructure cycle. And the reason being that India entered into the pandemic year of 2020 on the back of slowing growth and therefore higher fiscal deficit and debt. So that gave India only limited room even to undertake pandemic-related mitigation and stimulus measures on the fiscal side. Naturally, even to finance a post-pandemic recovery, to create a public infrastructure spending program, resources were indeed a constraint. What better way to acquire those resources by unlocking the government money that is already invested in the brownfield assets? And that is the thought process. So the brownfield assets have to be monetized and the resources obtained to make greenfield investments by the government without necessarily straining public finances. That is one motivation. The second motivation, as is always the case, is that in general, the belief is, although global empirical evidence may point to a mixed record on this matter, but the belief is that the private sector does a better job of extracting value or even social and economic return out of these assets than the public sector could do so. And that is the reason why the government has decided to co-opt the private sector. But the most important distinction between this approach and the earlier public-private partnerships is that there isn't an explicit privatization, i.e. transfer of ownership of assets envisaged in this national monetization program. What is envisaged is maybe upfront lease payments, revenue sharing, or just purely be an operating contractor. So many of these arrangements are envisaged. But there is no privatization. So to that extent, it is not as if the family silver is being signed away at throwaway prices to the private sector. And therefore, to that extent, that particular complaint or concern shouldn't be a big factor. But that said, in every situation of this nature, where the public sector invites the private sector to participate, and then there is a valuation of assets or the expected revenue stream involved, etc. There is always the concern that execution, what matters is execution. I mean, that's a truism. What matters is execution can be said in private lives as well as in public policy and execution. I mean, you may have a plan to become a millionaire, but you have to execute it. Whether it requires acquiring higher education or getting a good employment or investing in financial markets or other assets, it has to be executed. So that execution matters is something that can be said for any number of affairs. And that isn't a particularly perceptive observation to make, as we have read in many of the commentaries related to this particular announcement of the government. What can, however, be drilled down further is what is the method of valuation of these assets? What is the discount rate that is applied to understand and put a present value of the revenue stream? And what is the traffic projections? What are the assumptions being made about the best possible value that can be assigned? All those things in turn impinge on the potential economic growth rate that is assumed by the government. So there is a sort of a endogenous loop here between the economic growth assumptions and the traffic assumptions. And the traffic growth in turn will naturally give us an idea of what the potential economic growth of the country can be. So that is where I think there are some concerns that some of the assumptions that have been made by the government could be unrealistic, because enough bidders may not emerge for some of these assets because the reserve price or the expected revenue generation may not materialize, and therefore the bid price for some of those assets may be too high. And to some extent, the reason why bureaucracy sets such a high reserve price and makes certain assumptions about revenue growth, traffic growth, or even airport utilization rates, etc., is that they don't want to be blamed subsequently through parliamentary investigations or other agencies that they kind of undervalued the assets. So the inherent element of uncertainty has to be appreciated by not only the bureaucracy, but also the so-called accountability agencies like the Central Bureau of Investigation, the Controller and Auditor General of India, and the Central Vigilance Commission, etc. So there has to be a certain bona fide that has to be accepted, even if the calculations ex post turn out to be different, because these projections are being made in an environment of extreme uncertainty. For example, the oil prices have risen so much in the last 2 months subsequent to the announcement of the National Monetization Pipeline. That will have its own impact on vehicular traffic, etc. So therefore, in order to make this program succeed, while we agree that in principle execution matters, this execution should be drilled down into the kind of assumptions used in valuing these assets, in assumptions used in setting the volume of economic activity that will pass through these assets, and therefore to the extent that private sector would find it viable to bid for these assets. I think that is where, so whether the devil or the angel, both lie in the details. And that is what would be required to make this program a success. Let me conclude with some few final thoughts on this. Let me just see how much of time I have. 45 seconds. So basically, I believe that this program has a better chance of succeeding than in the past, for the simple reason that financing conditions in India remain accommodative. The private sector should be able to find the resources that would be needed to bid for these assets. And the private sector balance sheet is also in a fairly strong footing after 10 years of repair and restructuring. Therefore, some of the enabling conditions are there for this program to succeed and bring in the resources required for the government to invest in greenfield assets. So I would say, in order to overuse a cliched phrase, I would remain cautiously optimistic about the National Monetization Pipeline. Over to you, Amitendra. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nageshwaran. Thank you for taking off from where I dropped off. I'm exceedingly sorry, panelists and our guests invited today. My internet became unstable and I must have just frozen. Thank you very much for taking over. And I must say thank you very much for sounding a note of what I would call, what you have called cautious optimism, because yes, the inherent uncertainty under which these calculations have been taken into account persist. In a government setup, in a parliamentary setup, these have to be factored in. There are no two ways about it. But the good thing that you have drawn attention to is that the resilience of the private sector, the capacity of the balance sheet, and the fact that resources are available are there. And I would think that with the 6 month or 8 month of preparation, which has gone before starting the making the announcement, I think there is a great deal of optimism and I would be very upbeat about it all. So thank you very much for putting in a word where I fell off. And number two, for giving us a perspective on it on. Now, may I call upon Dr. Professor Rajesh Chakrabarty, Director from the Management Development Institute, to please take on from here. Professor Chakrabarty, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. And I would request Amitendu or Mr. Rai to just make sure that I do not exceed my 10 minutes and keep a, once you get professors going, it's very difficult to stop them. So I would request time. So I think, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this panel discussion. And obviously, this topic is the key topic of the day, of the month, of the year possibly in India. And I think Mr. Nageshwaran already touched upon most, if not all, of the key points here. So, I do not have any great expertise in this area, but I happen to have worked a little bit on public-private partnership in the past. And the National Monetization Pipeline looks to some people as a variant of a public-private partnership, or rather post facto PPP model. Right? In the normal PPP setup, the private and the public come together to create that asset, and then the private manages it for a while and then hands it over back to the public. Of course, ownership always stays with the public entity. Private only has a 20 years, 25 years, whatever the horizon is, to run the functioning. That's the standard BOT operation, build, operate, transfer. In this case, because it's brownfield, the build part is out, and with that goes a lot of risks that is associated with building infrastructure. So clearly, the invitation to the private sector here is that, well, we have got a performing, functioning asset to be taken over by the private sector and to be run for a certain horizon of time, a certain time window, maybe 20, 25 years. I don't know the exact details of those, but Those are usually the time frames for infrastructure projects. And with the assumption that, as Nageshwaran rightly mentioned, that there is a certain faith that private sector is going to accomplish implementational superiority advantages over what government could do on a day-to-day basis. So therefore, be able to create a delta of difference of total funds flow by being there. Now, that is probably not out of place. I think private sector entities have certain operational advantages in the manner that they are allowed to function, the flexibility that they enjoy. So they are likely to potentially do better, at least in certain areas, as also the global evidence on this is not unidirectional. It can be disputed, of course, but by and large, I think that's a reasonable hypothesis that there are advantages to giving this over to the private sector. Now, the question that one needs to get to, and I'm again coming back from my familiarity more with the traditional PPP setup, which is not exactly the thing here, but it's a variant of that PPP, a thing that one could argue that this NMP is, at least conceptually. Question is, well, what is the private sector going to pay the government for the right to operate now? So let's say, and I must admit that I have not really thought this through very clearly, but at least my initial thinking around this is, let's say over 25 years, the private sector projects a total present value of cash flows to itself to be 1,000 rupees. I'm just keeping the numbers easily manageable. Now, how much should it pay to government today out of that 1,000? Now, let's say that if government ran that asset for 25 years, it would have generated 800. And because private sector is superior, it is going to generate additional 200. So now, what is this part that we are talking about, the unlocking that is going to happen? Is it the 200 or is it the entire 1,000? What part of it is going to go to the private sector, to the public sector? How much money is going to come out of? We understand that family silver is not being signed away, but it looks like it is being kept in a deposit with a private entity for a while, and there is some advance that government is taking for that arrangement. So now, if you look at the 200, that is clearly, and let us say that the total, this 800, 200,000, whatever we are talking about, is the net surplus left after running costs have been taken into account. So now the question is, from the private sector's point of view, it's going to use, I would think, a higher discounting rate. And the reason why it's going to use a higher discounting rate is because it faces certain risks. Risks are there in any business. And in a PPP setting, this division of risk is a massive issue. And there's a lot of literature on who deserves to have control over what risks and what risks should be whose responsibility, because future is uncertain. And 25 years of future is massively uncertain. And so risks have to be taken into consideration. We are hearing this term de-risking. We understand that the de-risking applies to the construction risk, that the asset is functional, operating, so there is no construction risk left in there. But there are operational risks even with constructed functioning projects. Now, when we look at the three leading sectors, roads, railways, and power, they are very different ball games, each of them. And there can be lots of other sectors. I think a few others have been there more including water facilities and other things which could possibly be given out in this mode. But let's stick to roads, railways, and power. In roads, we have seen the PPP model work massively. Right? Anyone driving across the highways of India today would see privately operated and tolled roads all over the place. Now, to what extent the private sector actually has profited from it and gained, I have not looked at the literature very closely, but I think, like with everything else, my suspicion is here also it will be a mixed bag. But I'm sure there are some operators which have made the traffic predictions have probably exceeded. Now, I happen to live in Gurgaon, and Delhi-Gurgaon, there was a toll gate which drew a lot of flack, and it got dismantled once because it was causing massive traffic jams. So there are risks associated for the private player. The thing is that when the traffic projections can go wrong, I mean, not only can go wrong, it's almost never accurate. Everybody understands that. Right? If somebody puts in a piece of paper and says that, well, in 25 years it's going to go there, nobody takes it seriously in a literal sense. It's going to be, there's risks that it is going to be over that, or this is going to be below that. Now, the problem in the simplest model around here for the private sector is, once the traffic projection exceeds there is a windfall gain, government usually comes in and says, no, you have made enough. But once there is a shortfall, government is not going to come up as readily to say, all right, we are going to take that up. Sorry, we overcalculated the thing. So there is an asymmetry associated from the private sector's point of view about what it is getting into. That gives rise to a certain element of risk, which is in many ways a political risk. In the power sector, collection is a huge challenge. Power theft is a huge challenge. And it depends upon what is being given out, whether it's generation or whether it's distribution. Distribution has all kinds of risks, and how much you collect is a big challenge. Many of these challenges are not purely operational. They are also political. Do we have the willingness to collect? Do we have, is the correct political signaling going on when we impose certain measures that are needed to collect in certain places? So roads look fine. Railways, once again, the devil or the angel is absolutely in the details. So far, the railway offerings that have gone out, as we all know, have been a bit disappointment in drawing private sector attention. I don't know what the private sector is scared about there, but I think there is a general perception that partnering with government in public projects has lots of risks, all kinds of risks, some of which we can identify, and many of which we are not even sure what's going to happen, because in 25 years, governments change, may change, the rhetoric changes, socialism comes in, goes out, business-friendly government and budget-friendly government, all kinds of things make their appearance, disputes arise, and the problem is that the private sector has very little control over those risks. So in the presence of these risks, the discount rate, the risk-adjusted discount rate that the private sector must apply to these projects are only going to go high up, northwards. So now once those discount rates go up, your present value calculation in the eyes of the private sector is going to come down. So I'm not trying to be overly critical here. I'm just pointing out very basic financial calculations from a private sector point of view. Everything, of course, depends on our projections of the future and our assessment of those risks. But lots of things in PPP projects, particularly even huge, what do they call it, UMPP, the ultra mega power projects, that have run into massive problems because of unforeseen cost increases. So I think the private sector gets a bit nervous, saying, where do I step in, and are these things that are completely beyond my control? So that's a bit of a showstopper in this exercise. The other part is the source of finance. Now, does the private sector currently enjoy as much liquidity? Private investment of late, and this is pre-COVID, has not been fabulous. Right? It has been a bit anemic for a long while. So, and that's in conventional private sector projects. Infra, there are few selected players who have the confidence arising from wherever it arises from to take on infra projects. Many others are less confident of taking on infra projects. So with all of this happening, the participation here, and 6 lakh crores is a lot of money, 6 trillion is a lot of money. I'm not even going in that direction. But I think there is ground to be cautiously optimistic here, but probably more tilting towards caution than towards optimism. Right? I'm going to stop here and hand it back to the moderator.
Thank you, Professor Chakrabarty. Thank you. In fact, I was just going to say what you said, that thanks for adding that caution to the cautiously optimism part of it, because you have actually drawn attention to the fact that how much of the returns that the private sector would be willing to share with government, and after applying its discount rate and things like that, and the challenges that the private sector faces because of the legacy of government intervention when there are windfall gains. I've seen it in government, and it is, I must say, a very realistic position, because that does happen quite often. So thank you very much for drawing attention to these issues. They are to be taken into consideration now. We move on to our next panelist, Mrs. Sharmila Kanta, who is a principal consultant and lead with the International Research of Confederation of Indian Industry. She will give us her industry perspective, I'm hoping. Ms. Kanta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Rai. And thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this very interesting discussion. Our previous speakers have been outlining the prospects as well as the challenges with a note of cautious optimism for the National Monetization Pipeline. And as you said, I would like to give a perspective from the industry sector. So first of all, the NMP is a very, very progressive initiative. It has been described as bold, and it sends out two very clear and very welcome signals from the government. The first is the emphasis on getting more of the private sector participation into the economy. And the second is the commitment that there is to creating new infrastructure. Also, the asset pipeline strategy, I would say it is a part of a range of policy reform measures that the government has been announcing over the last few years, and particularly since the pandemic under the Atmanirbhar Bharat packages. And these reforms include, reduction in corporate tax rates, redefinition of the small enterprises sector, the power sector reforms, opening up of FDI, and so on. The government has also backed this up with a lot of action initiatives, which include the production-linked incentive scheme, setting up of development finance institution and asset reconstruction initiatives, industrial parks, and several others. So the asset monetization program is actually, it seems to be a much, a part of a very much larger strategy, which also includes the governments, as they have stated, the intended exit from business, permitting the private sector in strategic sectors such as defense and space, also promoting ease of doing business, including decriminalization of various business offenses, as well as creating more avenues for finance. So what we are seeing overall appears to be an expansion of the space for the private sector in the economy, and this, I would say, is extremely welcome. One of the issues, of course, infrastructure is a very major gap in the country, and it adds to the overall cost of doing business for companies. The National Infrastructure Pipeline in this regard is a move to bridge this gap, and it is, as people have pointed out, it is quite an ambitious program. In fact, what we had been suggesting from industry was that to encourage more private sector participation in infrastructure, there should be a ready shelf of projects which would provide the visibility for the investors. And this is actually what the NIP has done. It was launched in December 2019 with over 6,800 projects. And since then, it has expanded now to almost 8,200 projects with a cost of over $2 trillion in 34 subsectors. So the asset monetization pipeline actually supports this very large program through its aspiration to attract capital in infrastructure. And although the total outlay that we see in this is just about $85 billion, which is just about 5% of the estimated NIP project cost, this actually represents a major shift in the way that public assets are being used right now and the way that we raise resources for new infrastructure creation. Niti Aayog has outlined a very comprehensive methodology over its 2 volumes and also identified very specific projects from the different ministries as well as the public sector enterprises. And this provides a lot of clarity on which are the projects that are going to be coming up for asset monetization. And this in itself is a very welcome step forward. Now, industry would, of course, as the previous speakers have mentioned, we would look for the exact details that are brought out and how the assets will be going under the block. A key advantage, as we have seen, is that these are built assets. These are already constructed. So therefore, the risk will be appropriately scaled down, and there will be much higher sight on the potential revenue streams as well. Because if you compare it with the existing programs, then the potential revenue streams actually become much clearer. The public-private partnerships so far have been focusing on greenfield projects, and that is the way that the private sector has been looking at them. But now with the NMP, there is a shift again towards brownfield assets, and which are currently being operated by the public sector already. So also, this plan envisages quite a high share of innovative financing. And this in itself is very encouraging for the overall development of the Indian financial sector, which also is a gap when it comes to long-term financing. Patient capital is lacking in this whole endeavor. So once we have this innovative financing instruments in place, the space for private sector participation in infrastructure is likely to go up considerably. Again, private sector management efficiency is one of the reasons that the Niti Aayog has cited for putting up assets for maintenance and operations. There have been, fairly encouraging investment outcomes in the various sectors, and the addition of these brownfield assets into the available asset mix will actually mean that we are monetizing private sector efficiencies for the use of the public sector for further investments in infrastructure. So, of course, a lot does depend on how the line ministries as well as the public sector enterprises, now how do they structure the process, how attractive the final offers are proposed to be. And of course, this is going to be a very, very complex procedure with many different agencies being announced. And therefore, a lot of preparatory work will be needed. Of course, as mentioned earlier, valuation of the assets will be a key consideration for investors. Niti Aayog has provided different options for asset valuation, such as market, capex, book value, etc. And the specific model for the specific asset will actually determine the interest of the corporates in each of these. The other thing is how to factor in the public value of social goods, and monetization of the revenue stream will be important, since not all the assets will be purely on a commercial basis. Secondly, Niti Aayog has talked about regulation and monitoring of the progress of the assets. And this, again, we would expect to be a little light-handed so that the maximum value can be derived from the asset. There is a mention of the protection of user interests, and it remains to be seen how we are able to balance the public and the private concerns effectively so that investments flow in. And in this, we would need to take into account the pricing of the asset use for the consumers, as Dr. Chakrabarti has also mentioned, because also many of the assets might be in the nature of local monopolies. So right now, what we see is that the selection of the assets has been based partly on expectations for robust revenue flows. And therefore, we hope that the right balance points in the pricing can be identified. One important point is the tenure of the lease. We would have preferred, probably something like an outright sale. Private companies would have preferred that going forward. But of course, the longer the lease, the higher is the monetizable value for the government. And accordingly, the risks, the operational risk will also increase for the private sector. Then the vice versa for the shorter leases. So it will be essential to factor in the right lease term for each of the assets that are proposed to be put up for bidding. After this, transparency and clarity on the policies, policy stability, that would be a very important consideration for the prospective investors. The various financing models that have been put up, they expect the participation of overseas sovereign wealth funds and other overseas patient capital, such as insurance companies, etc. And for this to happen, the procedures for the bidding will have to be as per the global norms, which is what the overseas investors would be looking for. Then another one of the issues that has been pointed out is the availability of professional capabilities. Much of the work will be at the ministry level, where we would need the specialized cadre of officers who would be able to conceptualize and work out the details, the best schemes for each of these assets. And even in the private sector, the number of companies that are familiar with such structures, with operations and maintenance in the infrastructure sector is a little bit limited. And finally, one of the very important issues that industry will be looking at is dispute resolution, because over a long lease period of say 25 years, there are risks which will not be foreseen right now. And therefore, the disputes that may come up are also not known right now. But we need to have a very robust system which will settle cases well in time. And this robust system should be put in place ahead of when these assets go into under the block. So just to sum up, for the private sector, I think there are a lot of benefits that can be expected. First of all, the faster infrastructure construction with the public sector having more recourse to funds, that will aid overall economic growth with its own multiplier effect on income creation as well as job creation. And of course, this will, the more the infrastructure, the lower the costs for business can be expected. Then also with private sector efficiencies coming into the infrastructure sector, the projects can be much more efficient. And this will, of course, provide better services to industry. Thirdly, we have a shelf of monetizable public assets, which will be available for new business opportunities for people who have the adequate appetite to take the risk and who are able to conceptualize and avail of these business opportunities. Then there are the risks of infrastructure construction, which have now been kind of relegated. And the risks of the management are also reduced considerably, as there are already these ready projects on offer. The revenue streams have been, they will be defined well in advance. So there will be greater visibility on how to monetize each of these assets. And then, of course, the new financing models that will come in will be very, very beneficial for the private sector participation as a whole. Then there will also be regulatory frameworks, which Niti Aayog has said will be instituted for each of the sector, and that will bring in a lot of clarity to the overall infrastructure sector operations. So what we see is basically a whole of government approach in this program, and we do think that there will be more programs. For example, the Prime Minister has announced Gati Shakti, or the power of speed, during the previous Independence Day address. And that, of course, is also about $100 trillion worth that he has mentioned. So, and then, going forward, we would expect that with the success of these projects, the monetization, the state governments would also be encouraged to use the similar model. And so we see this asset monetization program as something that will give a big boost to the infrastructure sector and, of course, to the overall growth and employment generation in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sharmila Kanta. Thank you very much for your inputs, which were very insightful. And thank you for drawing attention to the fact of asset valuation, which is going to be very important for everything in this. I totally agree with you when you mentioned about the tenure of lease and the fact that the private sector would have preferred to have had it the outright sale rather than on lease. But just as to the two speakers before you have mentioned, they would rather not sell the family silver and have it only parked with the private sector for the time being, so that it is available to generations in future. But I think you've raised a very important point, as the speedy dispute resolution needs to be speedily, because that's about a huge amount of confidence in private investment. Inputs from the industry side. Now I call upon this afternoon Dr. Amatendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Studies. Dr. Palit, yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Rai. It's always a pleasure to take part in a discussion which is so ably moderated by you, and today even more so, because I'm in the presence of distinguished experts and good friends, Ananta, Rajesh, Sharmila. And we are discussing a subject on which a lot very effectively and efficiently has already been brought onto the table. I'd like to take a bit of a big picture perspective on this, and maybe a somewhat external foreign investor perspective on this to come to the subject. The first is, I think it is important to note, and there are already some details which have been shared in this regard, but the point is that there is a very major thrust on part of the government of India right now to mobilize funds for infrastructure. And infrastructure clearly remains not just the core fundamental on the basis of which the government is planning to develop the foundations of the economy, but the government at the same time also fully realizes the importance of mobilizing resources for infrastructure through as effective and as large a role of the public sector, of the private sector, that it can mobilize in this regard. So when one looks at the National Monetization Pipeline, it's important to note that this is in connection to the National Infrastructure Pipeline, the program that has been announced for infrastructure development holistically in the country. And this particular National Monetization Program, in terms of the asset classes that it has defined across a dozen sectors or more, is actually looking to mobilize resources, which is roughly around 5.5% of the total resources envisaged for the National Infrastructure Pipeline. And this, for the benefit of our friends in Singapore, would be roughly around 113 to 114 billion Sing dollars. Now, which essentially leaves one to the obvious conclusion that while this is one innovative financing that we are experiencing, on which a lot of thought has already gone into a strategy announced, there's probably more innovative financing in the future. That's the number one point I wanted to make. And the second point which I wanted to make in this regard is that when one looks at National Monetization Pipeline, and as a couple of my previous speakers have already alluded to this, it's important to distinguish from outright privatization of the public sector assets that the government holds. And a very pertinent example would be there's this entire exercise that's been going on for several months over privatization of the Air India, which is now at its very last point of finalization. That is privatization of government assets in which the ownership is getting handed over or being sold to private sector entities from the government. But in the National Monetization Pipeline, we don't see that. What we see is the private sector being brought in as a co-partner in the exercise for managing assets which are already functional and which are already being utilized for giving infrastructure services to the public at large. So this is one of those turfs where the private sector is essentially being looked at as an operator on the assumption, and it is by all means a correct assumption, that the private sector is much more efficient in several respects in running public sector assets. So in most cases, the operating principle will be to build, operate, transfer, and the private sector is perfectly well placed to expand the capacity of the assets which it is going to be given over to. And then in that respect, they can not only just expand their capacities, they can upgrade those, they can further sophisticate those, they can think of ways of innovatively generating more revenues. But after lease, and whatever be the tenure of the specific lease, that specific asset is going to go back to the government. So I think that distinction is important to be borne in mind. The third point is that there is this view that would this encourage private investors? And when we look at private investors, it's also important to look at the kind of investors that we are looking at. And as we all know, that when it comes to equity foreign direct investment flows that are coming into India, Singapore continues to remain the largest source of such flows. And I would also hasten to point out to the fact that India has obtained fairly robust equity foreign direct investment in the first quarter of the current financial year. It's also been able to attract sufficiently good investments in the startup space through venture capitalists. But let's look at this in the context of the fact that a large amount of these investments might actually be targeted towards greenfield operations. But what we look at the National Monetization Pipeline in terms of its objective is to actually monetize brownfield assets which are existing. Now, to what extent are these assets going to be attractive to the private inspector, notwithstanding the fact that there is a lot of visible long-term investor interest in India? I think this is where the best way to go about this and take a view of this is to take a sectoral position. What we see right now in terms of the approach paper and the documents that have come to us is that the roads and the assets in the roadways sector, the ones that are held by the National Highways Authorities of India, are going to be the largest chunk of assets that have been put up for monetization, followed by railways. Then there's oil and gas, electricity, telecommunications. Between them, these five sectors are making up for more than 80% of the assets that are to be monetized. And then there are several other sectors that are to be followed. Now, the big question over here is that when one looks at the roadways sector, obviously, not all kinds of investors from all nations are going to have expertise or interest in looking at managing the roads. So there is a question as to what extent this becomes a feasible alternative for, let's say, for example, those investors who are already probably looking at India closely or are already working in India on infrastructure assets. So, say, for example, when it comes to Singapore, we already have examples of very efficient Singapore companies like Asandas and Keppel working in India in the field of real estate and urban infrastructure space. We have the Singapore Airlines and the Tata participating in the civil aviation operations. We have the the Zurich Airport Authority building the latest airport that is being sort of created in the Greater Noida part of the Uttar Pradesh state of India. So there's already a lot of active on-ground foreign investor interest in infrastructure in India. Now, the challenge over here, as Ananta very rightly mentioned, is to actually ensure that the fine print of the strategy, sector-wise, asset class-wise, is developed in such a way that the private sector feels sufficiently emboldened and encouraged to bid for its operationalization. And this is where I think one of the challenges that is going to come in for the government at this point in time is since we are living with COVID and we are living with an enormous amount of uncertainty surrounding COVID, and also an uncertainty which is slowly creeping into the global financial markets, largely because of certain kinds of defaults that we are getting to see in China and some other parts of the world. There is a tendency towards current transactions like the NMP getting determined more by the buyer's prerogative as opposed to being a seller's prerogative. So in the sense, this is probably a case where this is more of a buyer's market as opposed to a seller's market. So what I personally feel, and this is where I would love to hear the views of my co-panelists, I think ultimately, in a way, the government has really gone as far as it could have in a fairly substantive fashion, except for, dotting the I's and crossing the T's on specific projects and making them as composite, investor-friendly, and attractive as possible, making them simple, not making them very clause-heavy, ensuring that the dispute issues are well taken care of. I think a substantial amount of comfort is provided by the fact that the NMP comes at a time when provisions like the retrospective taxation have been withdrawn. I think, given all this, the government really, at a point in time, it's probably done a lot insofar as signaling and declaring its clear intent is concerned. All that it needs to do now is to put in place effective people for managing the projects, get as much of technical professionals as possible, make the contracts simple. But then again, notwithstanding that, fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of the decisions, ultimately in terms of the investor interest in the NMP, is going to depend upon the global and regional conditions. And that is where I think right now we are probably not in a position to take a view on whether the NMP will be successful or unsuccessful, or whether it will be somewhere in between. I think this is something which we need to wait and watch closely. And some of it is going to depend upon what is happening internally within India, but a large part of it is also going to happen upon what is happening outside India. Thank you so much, sir. I return the floor back to Mr. Rai.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Palit. Thank you very much for that insightful presentation, because you have helped us segue into the next part of our discussions. The issue is that the government has gone as far as it could have gone in terms of crossing the I's and dotting the T's, crossing the T's and dotting the I's, as you mentioned. So let us take up some of the questions that have come. And now there is one. Is it ideal to monetize at a stage when economic growth is down, which means we've been hit by COVID-19? There is a fear of the third wave coming. Although the recent GDP growth rate has shown high numbers, it is mostly due to low base effect. And I think the person best positioned to answer this would be Dr. Ananda Nageshwaran, because he knows when the government decided to put this into place and after what were the experiments that were undertaken. Dr. Nageshwaran, would you like to take this?
Sure. I suppose there isn't any particularly more propitious time to undertake this, because when economic growth is really good, then probably there wouldn't be any need for this. So when economic growth is not necessarily down, but is beginning to look up, and that is the time when the government actually announced it. So it is not that the government announced this National Monetization Pipeline initiative when the economy was getting into a slowdown, but when the economy was bottoming out. And more importantly, the financial system repair in India has kind of largely been accomplished, even though it has been done mostly through piecemeal reforms, but mainly because of the sheer attrition of time and provisioning for bad assets. The bank balance sheets have improved and corporate sector has completed largely its deleveraging. So therefore, the announcement, I would argue that the timing is probably as good as it gets. Then the point mentioned about the third wave, well, I think we have had ICMR's seroprevalence studies, which showed that around 2/3 of the population is exposed to the antibodies, etc., has been exposed to the virus already. And remember, the Delta variant that is now currently sort of raging through many other countries, you might say India had either the mortification or quote unquote the advantage of suffering from it earlier in the cycle compared to others. So I think the third wave might turn out to be a ripple rather than a wave. So even from that perspective, it is not as if the government has announced it and the probability, and ultimately we are speaking in terms of probabilities, not in terms of certainties. So the probability that the government announced it while the country would eventually get into a third wave, that is, I think it's a matter of conjecture. And I would say the chances that the government took are fairly reasonable. I suppose this answers the question. And yes, the growth rate is definitely looking good because of the base effect, especially in the first fiscal quarter, because of the previous year's first fiscal quarter, April to June being a huge contraction. But that said, the overall 21-22 real growth rate forecasts have been revised higher more recently, after they were initially revised lower in the earlier months. Now, the feeling is that it is going to be somewhere between 10 and 11% rather than 8 and 9%. And if anything, the growth rates for 22-23 are also being revised higher. But yes, we are speaking with a wide band of uncertainty that is well understood. But I think the timing is not something that I would criticize them for.
No, I agree entirely with you. And I think, thank you for drawing attention to that. I would also feel, and like most of us would be, that actually there is no one such propitious time for these things. Government has put in a lot of spade work, a lot of background work has gone into it. And having tested the waters, I think this seems to be the right time to have entered in it, because more than anything else, the crying need for investment in physical infrastructure, I mean, you can't be a second too late on that. And I think government has stepped in absolutely on the right time. Another question which I'd like to check up from you, and I would like to have the feedback on this from Professor Chakrabarti and Ms. Sharmila also. Everybody has drawn attention to delayed approvals, clearances, policy constraints, and sometimes the lack of coordination between state and central governments and between sectoral things. Now, how much do you think of meticulous planning which has gone into the coordination, and how much will need to be addressed to ensure that these underlying structural and legacy issues do not provide a bit of a stumbling block? First from you, then I would like to have the comments of Professor Chakrabarti and Ms. Kanta also.
Sure. No, I think that's a very good question. And I think to a large extent, Ms. Kanta answered it in her remarks by saying that there was a whole of government approach to this NMP. So within the union government level, there has been a lot of prior consultation. The very fact that secretaries of more than 7-8 ministries were present when the announcement was made was not just a matter of optics, but also a signal of the buy-in that has taken place already. So to that extent, one leg of the coordination issue has been addressed. But the second leg of the coordination issue with respect to the state governments, and there I think a lot more needs to be done. And if anything, I would say the recent track record gives as much room for encouragement as it gives room for concern as well, with respect to the differences that are being aired in the public by many state chief ministers and finance ministers. So I would say the importance of coordination with the state governments is really a good question to ask, and there we can only hope, given the manner in which the government has bought in the consent of the union ministries, similar approach, participatory approach would be adopted with respect to state governments. But I don't have any other concrete instance to point here that this has been addressed already. That is my answer. Back to you, sir.
Professor Chakrabarti, would you like to take this on further?
Thank you, sir. So I broadly agree with what Dr. Nageshwaran just said. I'll just put a broad brush comment, if that is appropriate here. I think over the last few years, rightly or wrongly, the private sector's perception of bureaucratic tangles as a challenge to keeping projects on track has probably reduced. And this may be a very overly generalized statement, but it seems now that in the mind of the potential investor, the thought is that well, if the government meaning the political leadership and the top echelons of the government, if they have signed off on a project, they'll make sure that the bureaucrats fall in line, which was not a confidence that they always had in the past. Now, I mean, there is no guarantee of saying that this confidence is appropriately placed or it's a misplaced faith. That time will tell. But I think the investors or the private sector players, when they look at the politicians versus bureaucrats, they now think that the power is in the hands of the politicians, and politicians will make bureaucrats run the way they want the country to run. So to that extent, this disentangling the bureaucratic mess is sort of sold to the investor. I mean, once again, nothing is 100% there, and there can be exceptions to whatever that I'm saying here. And they may very well be, and they may be taken in that views. But by and large, the faith is there that if the leadership is signing off on something, it'll get done. So that is a positive. Now the center state matter is a slightly different matter. And that is not a pure bureaucratic question. There are political questions out there. I mean, are all parties on board on this? Are they willingly on board? Are they gaming the system? Are they setting traps for each other? And am I going to get caught in that crossfire? Right? So that question is less clearly settled. I mean, I'm not saying that the former is settled either, but at least in the minds of the investor, there is a certain political stability that is perceived, and which may not carry over to the center state question. Now, which one of these perceptions are going to be borne out by facts, of course, remains to be seen going forward.
Thank you. Ms. Sharmila Kanta, would you like to add to this?
Yes, I just wanted to emphasize that the government has been taking a lot of actions on the ease of doing business and on decriminalization of offenses and weeding out of archaic laws. And this has certainly created a lot more confidence among the private investors. Secondly, when it comes to the state governments, the aspect that Niti Aayog has been doing of competitive federalism is very important, because what happens is that the states are bringing out multiple policies themselves to attract investments from the private sector. And therefore, we have seen this playing out, for example, in the roads and highways sector, where the state governments have been fully aligned with the national highway programs, and they have been really, become much more accelerated in terms of project execution. So a lot of the uncertainty that was vesting earlier in these government relations with the private sector is now alleviated. And I would say that in this national monetization program, there is also the a cabinet committee which has been set up, which has got all the secretaries in it, and that itself would be there to iron out all the problems that investors are facing. And I think the regulatory aspect, when that comes in, when that kicks in, when the regulators are set up, that also will be, will help in reducing the uncertainties for the private sector in the operations and maintenance. And also, of course, since these are only limited to operations and maintenance, there is not that much of risk as there would be in the greenfield projects. So I think this, from the tripartite partnership of central, state and private sector, I think this monetization program will work out quite effectively.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting. That all aspects have been taken care of, and I think to some extent, this cautious optimism that we've all talked about, there will be hopefully more optimism to it. Dr. Palit, sitting where you are, the helicopter view that you'll probably get sitting in Singapore, what do you think of the issues regarding dispute resolution, which has been talked about? And I'm saying this in the context of what we have just seen in Kane Energy or Voda issues, because the government has, at the very right point of time, come forward and to try to resolve it, but what are the legacy factors that you think might be playing in the minds of potential investors? Would you like to draw attention to that, Dr. Palik?
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. I think, as I said, that we should be looking at the NMP to have come at a time when this has not come in isolation, but there have been other supporting, complementing measures that have already been announced by the government. And these I alluded to the retrospective taxation amendment withdrawal. But I'm glad that you also draw attention to the question of disputes, because for a very long time, one of the niggling worries at the back of the minds of potential.
We seem to have lost Amit.
Yeah, have we lost Amit?
In arriving at conclusions and the opportunity cost that investors need to forego as a result of that. So that, I think, to a very large extent has been a major concern, and probably understandably so. But today, when one looks at the examples, let's say, for example, the KN example or the Vodafone example, and the fact that the government of India has very clearly sent a signal that, look, if this is the issue that is worrying investors, then the government is willing to work with the investors on this, and disputes or the point of going back to them or lingering with them is certainly not going to be the key obstacle in this regard. But having said that, I would also like to draw an attention to the fact that this has just come. And when I said this, the decision with respect to the care, it's certainly going to have welcome implications across the entire investor profile. But the investors would also have at their back of mind some concerns over what exactly happens on ground, because not everything might be as big as a cane or a Vodafone thing, but there might be small issues which might tend to blow up into big disputes entailing large costs. I think to that extent, it depends critically upon what kind of assets we are talking about, which sectors we are looking into, and where are they physically located. I think the experience would show that, let's say, for example, when one looks at agencies like the NHAI, the NHAI might be a relatively easier entity to negotiate and come to settlement with, as opposed to maybe the Indian Railways. I mean, this is a purely hypothetical example that I'm offering. So I think to that extent, there might be a sector-specific influence of the question of disputes and the character of contracts that would be important for the investor, the foreign investor, when he or she looks at this subject.
Good, thank you. Thank you for that inputs. There's another question that we've received, something which has been playing upon lots of minds. In fact, I've been worried about it, is that does monetizing public infrastructure squeeze the already pinched lower and middle classes? Does the government plan to rectify this by intervening whenever necessary? What are the implications of this problem? I guess it is directed towards user costs that may come into play once these assets are taken over for operation by a private investor. Mr. Dr. Nageshwaran, I guess you will have to play for the government on this.
No, I think this question is an intelligent and interesting one. However, there are two considerations. One offsets the other. The first consideration, as you pointed out, is that there is a potential for the private sector to charge economic user charges, whereas a government in public spirit might charge a lower set of fees. That said, the other consideration here that needs to be brought in, with the government releasing its own resources by letting the private sector take the burden and the risk of downstream risk, it is able to actually create greater growth and give itself more resources to undertake direct benefits transfer to the much more weaker and vulnerable segments more directly. So on the one hand, you are only charging more for those who specifically use those services. Whereas a government that is starved of resources might end up hurting all the poor and lower income classes. So I would not, so when I have to make a moral judgment and an economic judgment here, targeted higher levies on specific users is always better than a generalized inability of the government to provide relief, fiscal relief and other relief to the overall poor and lower income population, with the government unlocking its own resources in this manner, actually therefore equips itself to serve the latter, a much general larger pool of population better than this way. Therefore, on balance, I would argue that this isn't hurting the poor and the lower income class. On the contrary, on balance, it is a net benefit. Back to you.
Oh, thank you very much for providing that, that comment. It does in some ways soothe the heart, because if you were increasing levies on power, on roads and everything else for the poor consumer ultimately. We've got another very interesting question, and that says that would there be any, what would you believe would be the way forward for local financing, which means municipal bonds and local currency financing? Very interesting, because I would think that lots of local bodies have been experimenting with trying to, use their strength of their balance sheet to raise funds on the basis of the strength and the bonds that they are issued. I've seen this in Kerala. I've seen it happen in Karnataka, but these are obviously much, much smaller projects. So the capacity to be able to leverage that balance sheet would be only for small projects. But I don't know if anybody else has any input on this about the capacity of local bodies to be able to leverage their balance sheets to or issue bonds to take on such assets, brownfield assets, which they think they can operate. Anybody would like to put in word on this? Well, if nothing further, there is another question which has come, which says, would there be any specialized agency that works in tandem with the line ministries to implement the NMP? And how could different parties across varying levels of society, bureaucracy, companies, and government come together to moot an institutional framework to regulate? Anybody?
I think let me take a stab at it. And before that, I would like to respond to a very interesting final observation that Dr. Vinod Rai, made in the previous two questions before this one, which is about the net impact on the government's ability to take care of the poor, whether this actually is a adverse development. And he talked about the charges that the government levies for fuel, utility, electricity products. So I think that's a very important question that he raised, which is about the current level of indirect taxes on the fuel products. I think that is something that is a separate discussion, but Dr. Vinod Rai was very right to highlight that particular issue, which of course isn't necessarily pertinent to the impact that the NMP itself will have on the poor and the lower income people, which I believe on balance is a positive thing. But the point Dr. Rai made about the government charges on the fuel products and essential products is a topic worthy of discussion independently of this. Having said that, coming back to this point about the need for a specialized agency, what we understand is that we need to have independent sectoral regulators, which is not yet in place for all sectors. Maybe I'm wrong, but Dr. Roy probably knows better than me on this. But within the finance ministry, I think there is a specialized cell that is going to coordinate this NMP project. So to that extent, it does address the issue of, is there a dedicated body that will take care of this? But that doesn't obviate the need for independent sector-specific competent regulators, which I don't think is in place for all sectors. Back to you, Dr. Raj.
Thank you, Dr. Palit, you'd like to add a word to this?
I actually had a thought on my mind, sir, and if you don't mind, I wanted to get the response on this from Anantha, maybe from you and Sharmila as well. What I'm just thinking aloud is that what we have seen through the National Monetization Pipeline is an effort by the government to monetize its own assets, but these are all central government assets. Do we envisage the possibility that the NMP and the way it is managed and the way it rolls out might also down the line encourage some state governments to similarly monetize their own public sector assets? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Dr. Nageshwaran, I think
No, I have spoken a lot. Maybe you and Miss Kanta should first respond. My answer is very simple. I hope he is right. So that is my response to Amit.
Dr. Sharmila Kanta, would you like to?
Yeah, so I think the original intention is to involve the state governments in this national monetization pipeline and make it a state monetization pipeline as well. But I think the government is, feeling its way ahead on the stones and all that, so that they are able to see the success rate of the national program first, and then encourage the states to go forward for it. The central government has also been incentivizing the state governments. They have set up a fund which will encourage this, which the states can use for such kind of programs for building infrastructure. And so also we need to see that when these monetization proceeds actually come in, that they are being used for new infrastructure creation, and that they do not go into other secondary expenses of the government. So it has to be very clearly determined that what infrastructure must go in from infrastructure into infrastructure, whether it is at the national level or whether it is at the state level. On the institutional side, there was a decision earlier to set up what they called a 3P India Institute, which is public-private partnership institute, which would kind of look at all these issues and also set in place model concession agreements and institute new frameworks for such kind of things. Also, there is the talk coming up of setting up alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. So these, and of course the regulatory agencies. So these three pillars of the entire PPP framework were being contemplated, and I'm not sure what the progress is on this, but they definitely should be put in place for a proper leveraging of this entire program. Thank you.
No, I think this is a very interesting proposition which has come forward, because it must be said to the credit of the central government that they have structured a program which I think is very workable. And I think the industry feedback has also been positive towards it. But they have not waded into the state territory. They have incentivized states, they have encouraged states, they've given them a model of a format of kind of things that if you wish, you could also take it. And the previous question about local bodies was in fact alluding to it. Lots of local bodies have got, and I'm aware, as I mentioned earlier, that Kerala has set up an infrastructure financing board, which draws funds from various institutions and is getting into greenfield and brownfield kind of projects. And a couple of the brownfield projects that they've taken over have provided a very good utilization of those assets, which were, I would say, in some ways being heavily underutilized with the public sector. So I think that has worked very well. And going forward, looking at the government's intent, for example, with the progress that has been made in the disinvestment of Air India, I think I've been hearing of it over the last 15 years. Will be able to get over all these, what I would call minor issues, because ultimately only when you apply yourself to the problems can you find the solution. It cannot be done sitting in, doing academic or theoretical models alone. And that's why there was a question which came earlier, which says that
I think if I could just take this opportunity to thank everybody. Yeah. And sir, I was just also trying to add to your final comments by thanking everybody, particularly our distinguished panelists, Ananta Nageshwaran. Ananta is one of ISAS as well now in his capacity as a non-resident senior fellow. Thank you, Ananta, for sparing your time. Thank you, Sharmila, for providing such valuable insights. And thank you, Rajesh, for being with us today. We hope to have more conversations on this subject as we go ahead. And we really look forward to having all of you with us again in future. So have a very good day ahead. Stay safe and be in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amitendra.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone.